Well, hello again, and welcome back to the latest recap of The Rings of Power. This time it's episode 4, The Great Wave. And quite a lot has happened in this episode, and there's some interesting connections to broader parts of Lord of the Rings lore that I'm going to go through, particularly to do with Numenor. And I touched on these in the previous episode. But first of all, just to issue a correction, as we now know, what was in the box in Khazad-dûm that the dwarves were protecting was not, as I thought it might be, a Silmaril. It was Mithril, or Mithril. And that works well. In fact, it probably works better because a Silmaril would have completely upended the storyline as it exists currently. So I'm quite glad they didn't go with the Silmaril in the end. It's also nice just to see the discovery of Mithril been fictionalized. Why not? After all, it was first found in Khazad-dûm, if I am not mistaken. But yes, so unlike in previous episodes, we don't have. I think this is the first episode without any of the Harfoot storyline, which is interesting. Which does make sense because the Harfoot storyline was left with them on migration the end of last episode, so it makes sense for them to not be in this episode and then come back in the next one. But we have 3 major storylines in this, although those 3 have their own sub-storylines within them. We have the storyline of Numenor, of course, and Galadriel continuing to be in Numenor. We have the storyline of the tower in the east and the orcs there. And we have the dwarves, i.e. within Khazad-dûm, and, of course, Durin's relationship with Elrond, most particularly. So, starting off with the Khazad-dûm storyline, I think what I liked about this storyline this time was that it ultimately focuses on the relationship between Elrond and Durin. I actually think that this storyline is a good example of how to weave broader world building into ultimately a story about characters and their relationships. Elrond and Durin's attempt to rebuild their friendship, certainly Elrond's attempt to really rebuild their friendship, is nicely intertwined with the broader relationship issues between dwarves and elves, and also the construction of the forge that Celebrimbor needs to make the rings, and of course the discovery of Mithril. It works well, and it gives us a great case study of 2 people trying to put back together a broken friendship, while at the same time the broader world building stuff tells us a lot about the world, new discoveries, new understandings that's happening within Middle-earth at this time, and also the political situation between the elves and the dwarves. So yeah, overall I think it works very well, both as a character piece and as a broader piece of world building. It reminds me actually of the success that in the second Lord of the Rings film, The Two Towers, where Rohan is portrayed in a very interesting way, where you get the sense of the culture and the history of Rohan, the place, while at the same time bringing that together with the overarching story and the narrative of the assault on Rohan and the effect on Theoden of Theodred's death. They do a good job at showing that, putting together the world building and the characters. In terms of specific moments from that, I think I really liked the singing by, I forget the name of the character, but by Durin's wife. I thought that was a really, really nice piece of music and song, which again is very important to Lord of the Rings and the broader Middle-earth history within how Tolkien wrote it. Anyone who's read the Lord of the Rings will tell you how important songs are to the narrative and to the structure of the book. I also thought that swearing the oath and afterwards the mind collapse was done very well. I did genuinely wonder whether or not Durin had died in that, although I assumed that he didn't because he's too important a character for that, at least at this point. But aside from that, not a huge amount happened within the Dwarven storyline. Obviously, it ends with the king sending Durin off to Lindon, and presumably, and we as the as the audience aren't entirely sure what the dwarves are suspicious of. Are they suspicious of the rings being made, or is there something else going on here? Are they correct or are they incorrect in their suspicions? It's not entirely clear. Finally, I thought also the idea of relationship between fathers and sons was handled very well here. The idea of Durin feeling trapped by his father, of Elrond struggling to live up to his father's expectations, but also the grief that one feels when one cannot, speak to a parent or a loved one who's passed on. It was handled very well, and I thought that was a very interesting and well put together scene that focused ultimately on the idea of living up to the expectations of one's father or just prior generations in general, given that lineage is a common theme in both the Lord of the Rings more generally and in Rings of Power, as is also being mirrored in the Numenorian storyline that we'll get to, I thought it did very well. So moving on then from the Elrond Durin storyline, I do also want to say that I'm interested to see what happens when Durin goes to Lindon. I'm assuming we'll have some sort of fish out of water light comedy, but ultimately I wonder how that storyline is going to develop, because we only have now 4 more episodes, so we're halfway through the season at this point. So I'm going to be interested to see how much, presumably the rings aren't going to be forged at the end of this series, but maybe they are. Oh yes, and that that does remind me of another thing I wanted to briefly mention. I did feel that in both the Dwarven Elven Khazad-dûm storyline and the storyline of the Tower, it did feel like there had been a somewhat serious time jump between when we last saw them. The Numenorian storyline basically continued directly after where we'd last seen it, whereas the Elven Dwarven storyline feels like, we saw that the construction of the forge was taking place and was quite far along. So it implies that there's been at least a significant time jump between when we last saw the dwarves and the elves and this. And similarly, last time we saw the villagers, they just seen one orc head and were on their way to the tower. And now it seems like the entire countryside has come up to the tower, and also, importantly, that the entire countryside understands and knows that the orcs exist, which is a big change. This obviously, to a certain extent, is just a part of the way they're going to have to do these series, because they are jumping across. They are trying to tell an epic story in 8 episodes, and that's not easy. We've already had one major time jump when Galadriel passes out on the raft and then wakes up in Numenor. But I thought it was just something that I find a little irritating. I think one of the strengths of the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones was the consistent narrative. The fact that things felt like they were continuous and led on one thing from the other rather than constantly jumping around. And I do feel like that's a problem with Rings of Power in a structural sense, that it just doesn't really have enough episodes for what it's trying to do. It does remind me slightly of Game of Thrones Season 8 in that regard, although nowhere near as bad as that. But ultimately, it's a minor point. I don't think it's too much of an issue, but, it's just something that I noticed. So, moving on to the Tower storyline, just because it's fairly brief. Quite a lot actually happened in this storyline, this episode. We see Bronwyn becoming the kind of de facto leader of the villagers, which is not surprising, but also is interesting, and I'm interested to see where it goes from there. We continue to see Theo's corruption, maybe, by the hilt, but also by his own sort of pig-headedness and arrogance, and that's kind of a theme throughout the broader episode. His decision to go back to the village obviously is a poor one, and one that almost cost him his life. But at the same time, his corruption by the hilt, and I can't remember the name of the bartender, but the revelation that there are people, which we kind of already knew, but we hadn't had explicitly stated, there are people within the villages who are still loyal to Sauron, is an interesting point, and that I think will almost certainly become a major factor whenever the orcs assault the town, the tower, which they probably will do at some point. It would make for a good climax for that particular storyline. So, aside from that, again, we had some good action scenes, some good tension within that storyline where he's hiding, when he's gone back to the town, Theo's gone back to the town and he's hiding. And of course, Arondir's bit of elf elf fighting skills at the end is also nice. Again, it's not too over the top, but it's over the top enough that it doesn't that it feels different and distinct from what's been done before in the Lord of the Rings films. Aside from that, of course, we have the person that everyone assumed, including me, to be Sauron, Arontar, but who may or may not be, depending on how they decide to go forward with his character, whether he's actually Sauron or whether he's a minion of Sauron, like the Mouth of Sauron, for example. It's not really clear. And his relationship to the orcs is also interesting. I mean, they call him father. But as far as I'm aware, Melkor was the father of the orcs, not Sauron. So I don't think he's meant to be Melkor or Morgoth. Melkor and Morgoth are two names for the same being. So it could be Sauron himself. It could be a different. The reason why I'm thinking maybe it's not Sauron, at least not now, is that he's not beautiful, and Sauron is described in this period very much, at least sometimes, as being beautiful. And that's how he tricks the elves and how he tricks Numenor. It doesn't mean he would always be beautiful, of course, but it does make me think that maybe this isn't Sauron. This is a lieutenant of Sauron in some respect. But of course, again, the revelation that there's a message, and that ultimately they will all be left alone and left to live if they side with Sauron. It's not. I think that obviously will come out and it will become something of an internal problem within the tower, and I can definitely see, much as Pharazôn is going to overthrow the Queen Regent, I think the bartender will probably overthrow the Bronwyn, and there will be a division between those who turn to Sauron and those who do not. But ultimately, that's for the future, and who knows, it might not go in that direction, but I think it probably will. So, moving on to the final and largest section that we need to talk about, which of course is Numenor. And I've saved this one for last because it is the largest, it has most to be discussed about it. So, obviously, this is where the title comes from, the Great Wave, and the idea of Numenor being flooded, which is, of course, how Numenor ends up, both in the books and, I'm presuming, in the TV show, since they are massively foreshadowing it. And I did want to quickly discuss a bit more about the lore of Numenor, because what they've done here is they've adapted the existing lore of Numenor quite well, in my opinion, because they haven't changed all that much. We've come to Numenor during the beginning of its downfall, when the Númenóreans had already turned their back on the elves and the Valar for the most part, but they were not actively hostile towards either yet. And we've come during the reign of Tar Palantir. And Tar Palantir was the king who attempted to turn back towards the elves and the Valar, and ultimately he is deposed for doing so by the son of his brother, so therefore his nephew, Tar Pharazôn, who then becomes the last king of Numenor and who leads Numenor into darkness. So, the big change in the storyline is the depiction of the Queen Regent. In the original Silmarillion, or actually, I can't remember if it's in the Silmarillion or if it's in the appendices, but effectively what happens there is that the Queen figure, the daughter of Tar Palantir, it does not become Queen Regent. The whole idea of Queen Regent is an invention for the show. Instead, she is supposed to become queen after her father by the right of Numenor, but Tar Pharazôn instead usurps the power and forcibly marries her, which causes them to be, it's cousin marriage, thereby denying her the right to rule. And I don't know if that's going to happen here, not least because they've changed Tar Pharazôn quite a bit. In the original, he's more of a sea captain and a sort of adventurer, whereas in this version, he's a politician and chancellor. There's no indication that he's related to the royal family. So I'm not sure whether they'll keep that aspect of the story or not. But certainly, the fact that he will overthrow the Queen Regent and the king in the tower is pretty obvious given his stance against the elves and his rabble-rousing at the beginning of the episode. So, yes, we ultimately have the setup for the actual, or at least a very close storyline to what originally happens. The good king comes to the throne, tries to prevent the downsliding, ultimately fails, is rejected and usurped, and then the downsliding continues. What we then expect to see is the division, more than it already is, of Numenorean society into those still loyal to the elves and those who are not, and the ultimate banishment of those who are loyal to the elves to the western side of the island, which is kind of implied to have already happened to some extent, which seems part of the reason why Isildur is so enamoured with the West, and the voices call to him from the West. Beyond that, we'll see how far they... certainly the decision at the end to have the Queen Regent accompany Galadriel to Middle-earth, nothing like that ever happens in the story of Numenor. And the big distinction, aside from the Queen Regent, within the story is Galadriel's appearance. They've worked Galadriel's appearance into the story of the downfall of Numenor by having her coming be the starting point of it, which works well, honestly. And equally, while I do believe Numenor had a Palantir, I don't think that it ever foresaw the downfall of Numenor or was used in that manner. That, to me, feels like an invention of the show. Although, again, it's been a while since I read the Silmarillion, so I could be wrong about that. But yes, so overall, I actually think it's a really well done and adapted story. They've kept the major elements, thus far at least, while adding in extra ones that either place the story of Numenor into the broader narrative better, like adding Galadriel into the story, or they've added in jumping off points for individual character storylines, like the storyline with Isildur and the son of Pharazôn's relationship with Isildur's sister, whose both of their names escape me. And of course, whatever Elendil ends up doing in this particular version. So yes, in terms of individual... Oh yes, the other thing that they do add in is the idea of the High King, the Tar Palantir, being ill. That's not something that exists in the original, but it does make sense here because there has to be a reason for the Queen to take over as Queen Regent. So having him... there's also something quite Arthurian about it, the idea of tying the health of the king or the leader being tied to the land And if the land suffers, the king suffers, and if the king suffers, the land suffers, vice versa. The story of the Fisher King is the most famous example of this, but it's quite a common trope across a lot of different mythologies. And again, the idea here of Tar Pilantir wasting away in the tower is also reminiscent of Theoden in the Lord of the Rings films, particularly in the adaptation by Peter Jackson, where he is literally being drained as the health of his society and culture is being drained. So is he physically being drained by Saruman. Yes, so I guess just to wrap up, there's a couple more sort of things that I wanted to quickly just discuss. So first of all, we continue with the more mythological approach. The discussion that Elrond gives of his father being actually uplifted by the Valar, and the whole idea of the much more mythological and this actually happened. Like a guy got made immortal and placed in the stars and that kind of thing, which is again much more obviously mythological than the Lord of the Rings films, which tend to be much more grounded and tend not to have so many elements like that. I'm not even sure the Valar are mentioned once actually in the Lord of the Rings films. Aside from maybe when Gandalf shouts at the Balrog, I can't think of any other examples of when the Valar are mentioned, or just in general the Maiai are mentioned, the sort of spirits. But yeah, so that's one thing, and again, I like that. I like the more mythological feel. It helps separate this series out from the Lord of the Rings films. And it's just a bit fresh and different. So, yeah. The other big thing that I wanted to discuss quickly is Galadriel's character arc. I actually really like it. I mentioned in the previous episode, I think, that one of the things that I like the most about the characterization of Galadriel and Elrond in this story is that, if we compare them to where they end up in the Lord of the Rings films, which, yes, these aren't technically predecessors to those, but they are written with that in mind to some extent. We see them take opposite paths. Elrond in The Lord of the Rings is stern. He's stern, forthright, and he doesn't suffer fools gladly. Whereas Galadriel in Lord of the Rings is reserved, reticent, thoughtful, and very much thinks before she speaks, despite being extremely powerful. And in The Rings of Power, we see that they've taken opposite paths. Galadriel starts out in Rings of Power as somebody who is very headstrong, arguably pig-headed, who just throws herself at problems and demands people do as she wants, which inevitably ends up just pissing them off, whether they are elves, in the case of Gil-galad, or men, in the case of the Queen Regent. While Elrond starts off as very much being a kind of politician, someone who resolves conflict through discussion, and he grows and becomes perhaps more willing to say what he means as time goes on. And so I quite like how we see this divergence. Elrond starts off more pliable and becomes harder, whereas Galadriel starts off very hard and allows herself to perhaps stop being quite so much like that, without feeling like these two characters are in any way kind of written badly. I think it actually works quite well. So I did want to mention that because we still see in this episode Galadriel start to recognise that maybe her headstrong decision-making is not a good thing, when it's pointed out to her that, she should actually try and understand other people's perspectives. And also when she goes into the tower and she realises that actually she's made a mistake by doing that. She shouldn't have gone to try and find Tar Palantir because there was a good reason why she was unable to speak with him. Whereas Elrond, by going to the mine and, swearing his oath, is not only able to repair his friendship with Durin, but he's also able to sort of stand up for himself a bit more and really kind of put Durin on the spot as to what's actually going on. So yeah, that was the final couple of things that I wanted to mention. Oh yes, one final thing. I did want to mention how I like how they are somewhat humanizing the orcs to some extent. The fact that the orcs have a sort of ritual for their dying member, and how his the trophy that he has of the Green Man chest plate taken from one of the elves is taken off him. The sort of the killing of him by Elrond, who it's not entirely clear if that was meant to be a mercy killing but certainly seemed more than just getting rid of somebody. It gives the orcs a little bit of culture and a little bit of humanization, which is nice. I don't think they're going to go too far with it, but they do certainly feel in Rings of Power less like just kind of a generic evil faction. And they do feel like, even though they're obviously the evil faction, they do have something more than that going on within their culture. So yes, there we go. Oh yes, and finally, I have to say that prosthetic when they stabbed the orc, that just looked really bad. It looked like rubber. I don't normally comment on stuff like that, but that just looked really fake to me. So yeah, anyway. But yeah, to end on a positive note, again, I think the series continues to go from strength to strength. The only big issue I can think of is the pacing and the time jumping between the different storylines. And I just hope that it comes to a satisfactory conclusion by the 8th episode, because I do fear that 8 episodes may not be enough. But then again, we shall see. So, anyway, I've been Alistair, the Knight of the Orchards. Please like and subscribe, ring the bell and all that. And I'll be putting out more reactions to the Rings of Power as the episodes come out. I should be starting to do some of this to House of the Dragon as well in the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that. Okay, goodbye.